psychology up at the University of Edinburgh, and you can see all my sort of contact details there and my Twitter account, although fair warning, I do mostly just tweet about Fulham Football Club, but occasionally about academic work. So I'm going to be talking today about the psychology of eating animals. Before doing that, I was asked if I say a little bit about my career, just to give you an idea of how I got here. And I'm very happy to answer questions people might have about careers in social psychology as well. And I know it's pretty daunting from the beginning. It wasn't that long ago I was there myself. So any questions you have about that, I'm also happy to answer, as well as questions about the psychology content itself. So I'll start the talk, if I can, with a little bit, just move this for myself, about myself, which is a weird place to start and not something academics are normally comfortable talking about, but just a bit of a background on who I am. So I'm a social psychologist, mostly do social cognition. On the left-hand side of the slide there, you can see basically my academic history. So I started doing this basically 20 years ago. I was in the start of my undergrad. And about 15 years ago, I was where you guys are at today. I was doing my graduate training at the University of Melbourne. I was really lucky since then to be able to secure a bunch of postdoc positions. So I worked as a postdoc in Melbourne, in England, down at the University of Kent, down the road from you guys in London. I also got positions in Canada and Belgium, short-term posts. And then about 5 years ago, I started my lectureship at the University of Edinburgh and have been working as an academic up there since. It's been a really kind career to me, especially in terms of traveling. So I've traveled all around, as you see there, Australia, Italy, Belgium, a whole bunch of places. I've been able to travel and live in and work. And it's not just been geographically mobile. One of the great things about especially the early stages, I feel, of an academic career is you can travel around topics. So I started off as a dehumanization researcher, spent about 10 years doing that intensively, and then developed concurrent interests in objectification, mostly the objectification of women, and the psychology of animals and how humans treat animals, basically. And that's the kind of work that I do today. So that's just a little bit of background in terms of, like I said, 15 years ago, I was where you guys are, and that's kind of the gap between there and now is measured by a succession of postdocs, a succession of continents, and a bunch of different research topics. So if you have any questions about that, like I said, I'm happy to answer them. Of course, it's not about me. It's not even the majority about me. I wouldn't be where I am today or able to show you the work I'm going to show you if it wasn't for my amazing collaborators. In particular, I could name a load of people, but these two guys, Jared Piazza and Brock Bastian, who've been most involved in the animals work I've done. So yeah, many thanks to them. Like I said, it wouldn't be possible without them. Okay. So how did it all start? Like, where did this interest, I guess, in the psychology of eating animals come from? When I was an undergrad and a grad student, I was very, very passionate about animal rights and went to a lot of animal rights gatherings, read a lot of articles, blog posts and stuff like that about animal rights. And I was always really struck by how vegans and vegan activists spoke about meat eaters, right? If you listen to the way they speak about meat eaters, they're just these terrible people who love animal suffering, who would literally, rip a steak off a pig and just chew it bloody in their hands. And they make them sound like demons. And this rhetoric floats around a lot, but then you meet meat eaters, or many of you yourselves will be meat eaters, and it doesn't really gel with how they see themselves and with how they see each other. And there seemed to be this big gap between the way that activists were talking about meat eaters and the kind as monsters, and the kinds of seemingly banal everyday behavior of meat eaters themselves. And it got me really thinking about the psychology of this. How can you be a meat eater and still think morally of yourself and that you're doing morally just and good things? And so this is what got me into the field, but I think there are good reasons to be interested in the psychology of eating animals beyond just being interested in group differences between meat eaters and vegans. So why should we care about meat as psychologists? We should care about meat for a bunch of reasons. So what you're looking at here is a picture of a map of England. The red square is the amount of land that's been burnt in the current West Coast US wildfires. Right? And while it might be kind of funny to point to things like gender reveal parties as the origins of this, the truth is that in all likelihood, a large portion of this is due to climate change. Right? And climate change leading to an increased number and intensity of wildfires that are burning down astronomical in the sense they can be seen from space, plots of land. Where is climate change coming from? Well, a lot of places, but the most polluting industry in the world for greenhouse gases is agriculture, and the most polluting part of that industry is meat production. So when we talk about meat, we're talking about the biggest polluter in the most polluting industry in the world. Getting people to eat less meat or no meat is a great way to combat the kind of climate change which is having catastrophic effects on the environment that we can witness today. It's kind of too early to say definitively, at least according to my brief Google search before this talk, where the COVID virus came from. It's certain that it was spread very rapidly through things like wet markets in China in its initial stages. But probably corona comes from people consuming meat, right? It's one of these zoonotic viruses that's crossed over the species boundary, and intensive farming of meat animals and consumption of meat is closely tied to the spread of all sorts of viruses, including the kinds of pandemics that are gripping the world in 2020. So in addition to the climate and environmental arguments, I think there's really good health arguments to say that we should be looking at reducing the intensity of farming, the intensity of meat consumption. So there are at least three good reasons. I think it's curious why people eat meat, and I think it's also of pressing environmental and health concern to understand why they eat it. Now, when I started thinking about this kind of work, originally back in 2010, I tried to adopt this sociological imagination and think, well, if an alien came down from Mars, right, and looked at humanity, how would it understand our relationship to animals? And I said, well, our relationship to animals is kind of paradoxical, because on one hand, the alien could come down and look at the way we treat animals and conclude that we love them, right? So we know that people consider pets to be part of their family. They'll run back into their burning house to save their dog in the same way they won't run back in to save their refrigerator. So they don't see them as objects. They see them as members of the family. We spend billions of pounds on them each year. If you look at the legal expansion of rights of animals, it's considerable. 150 years ago, you could basically do whatever you wanted with an animal if you owned it. And these days, if you harm that animal in a variety of ways, you'll end up in jail. And we now consider people who harm animals as amongst the most immoral members of our society. If in a social psychology experiment, you're ever looking for a group that you want to be really hated, animal abusers is right out there because people really despise them. So if we put them in our families, we spend a fortune on them, we protect them with the laws, and we hate people who hurt them, it sounds like we love animals. But we know this is only part of the story. And the same alien could look at our society and point out the fact that we love eating animals. Right? The average British person eats about 120 kilos of meat a year. So, call that 1.5 times to 2 times their body weight in meat every single year. And it's not just something they do, it's a cherished cultural activity, right? Sunday roast, Christmas ham, Christmas turkey. It's embedded in our culture that we bacon rolls from Greg's, right? It's an integral cultural activity in the UK. It's not just something that happens, it's something we value. It's difficult to get an accurate estimate on the number of animals killed every year because a lot of animals in developing countries are raised and killed without going through the formal marketplace. But it's somewhere in the area of about 50 billion animals each year, and that excludes sea life. 50 billion animals. In the US alone, they kill enough animals that if placed nose to tail, they would stretch from here to the moon and back 4 times every single year. So that's how many animals are being killed to provide us with meat. We also know that the lifespan and living conditions of farm animals is poor. right? So it's not that these animals have amazing lives before they're killed. They have pretty appalling lives before they're killed. So this led me to write about the meat paradox. This idea that the very same person who tells you they love animals and who genuinely seems to in terms of the money and time they spend with animals also loves eating animals. And I got interested psychologically in how does the same person maintain these two beliefs and engage in this seemingly inconsistent behavior over time. Now, as psychology students, you'll all be familiar with cognitive dissonance theory. And this was an idea introduced by Leon Festinger, but more recently written about by Eddie and Cindy Harmon-Jones and people like that. And it's a pretty straightforward idea. It's the notion that when you hold ideas or ideas and beliefs that are inconsistent, you experience cognitive dissonance, which is an inherently aversive state. Right? So if I believe that I love animals and I also believe that I love eating animals, these two beliefs should come into conflict, and that conflict should create cognitive dissonance, which makes us feel bad. Right? That should be pretty well known to everyone listening now. When people have dissonant beliefs, we know they benefit from at least two psychological systems. Right? The second system is the classic system, but I'm going to actually start with the first here, which is a more modern kind of approach to it, I guess, which is about dissonance avoidance. So the best way to not experience dissonance is to simply avoid experiencing it in the first place. And I would argue, and have argued in a paper that Brock Bastian and I published back in 2017, if you're interested in it. It's a very long, complex paper. I apologize for that in advance. The guts of it is that cognitive dissonance can be avoided by exploiting the way society is set up to help us avoid recognizing that we're eating animals, right? So society is structured in a way that allows us to not think about the animals we harm when we're consuming them. Right? So we avoid dissonance ever emerging in the first place. That's dissonance avoidance. Sometimes dissonance, however, will emerge. Sometimes something will happen to you, like maybe you sit down to hear an interesting talk about social psychology, but instead what you get is a lecture about how evil meat eaters are, and you happen to be a meat eater. When you're forced to recognize that you report caring about animals, but also you definitely eat animals, it creates a dissonant state, and that dissonant state can be reduced. Now, one way to reduce it is by simply cutting out meat consumption. Some people do that. Of course, vegetarians take the behavioral route out of cognitive dissonance by simply saying, well, I'm not going to engage in the behavior, and therefore I don't have the dissonance. Not everyone takes that. And there are a range of other psychological ways to reduce dissonance that I'm going to talk about. So they're the big two that I'm going to structure the talk around: dissonance avoidance, so finding ways to not feel dissonance in the first place, and dissonance reduction, when I feel dissonance, finding ways to get rid of it. So, meat and dissonance avoidance. So, I would argue that society and psychology interlock to help meat eaters avoid experiencing a dissonant state. And you can think about these, if you want, as outsourced dissonance processes. Reducing dissonance is hard. It takes cognitive effort and energy, and an easier way to do it is to say, you know what, society can do that for me. Society can help me avoid this emotion so that I don't have to do it. There are at least three ways in which we can avoid dissonance. One is in the way we categorize animals. The second is institutionalization. I'm not going to talk about this in length, so just briefly. Institutionalization, for instance, is the way we locate meat production and slaughtering away from major metropolitan areas. There's good economic reasons for that, but it also helps meat eaters avoid it. The way we present meat. So meat in the supermarket over the last 50 years is progressively fewer bones, less hair, less skin. All of that's disappearing. And we're now getting meat either as highly processed, like mince, or totally integrated into a meal, like a ready meal. Yeah. And so that's institutionalization. And the third is habitual behavior. And this is the idea that when a behavior becomes a habit, we engage in it without conscious reflection. So if meat eating is a habit, we eat meat, we just never think about animals because the consumption itself is habitual. Those two ideas are covered in the review paper I mentioned earlier. If you're interested in them specifically, I'm going to talk about categorization of animals. Okay, so categorization. Societies categorize animals in a way that makes sense to that society at that time, right? So of course, natural categories of animals, but the way lay people categorize animals is more flexible. So let me take two animals as an example, right? So dogs and horses. In the UK today, we think of dogs and horses as pets, right? But we know that in some parts of the country, and certainly in our past, dogs and horses were tools to be used on farms, so rounding up sheep and for pulling tractors and pulling plows and things like that before replaced by the tractor. So even though we categorize the animals as pets, we know that there are some people in our society and certainly in our past who categorize those animals as tools or implements. And some of you may also know that there are parts of the world where these same animals are categorized as food. So there are parts of Asia, parts of Europe, in fact, that categorize dogs as food, and certainly parts of southern France, northern Italy that characterize horses as food. Now, this is the exact same animal. It's just thought about, of course, in different ways by different people at different times. What we started thinking, my colleagues and I, is like, well, maybe the category into which an animal is placed shapes the kind of mind and moral rights that you're going to give that animal. And so an animal that's placed into the food category may simply be less deserving of our concern by virtue of being in that category than if it was not in that category. It's been known for a very long time in cognitive psychology that categories structure thinking and the perception of attributes to things that go in that category. So this is the first study I'm going to tell you about. So in this study, basically what we did is we got a group of participants, all Americans, and we showed them this animal that you can see here. Now, normally I would ask like if people know this animal, but it's kind of a clunky on Zoom. So just think to yourself, do you know this animal? Most people don't. So this is a Bennett's tree kangaroo. It's a marsupial that lives in the forests of Northern Australia and Papua New Guinea. Right? None of our participants knew what this thing was. And because they didn't know what it was, that gave us a lot of flexibility because we could tell them what category it belonged to. So we basically framed Bennett's tree kangaroo as belonging to two different categories. That's the framing column here. So in one case, it was framed as an animal. Okay, so in the top row, we simply said there's an animal called a Bennett's tree kangaroo, lives in Papua New Guinea, lives in trees, eats fruit. That's about all the participants learned. In the bottom row here, we told them the hunted meat condition. We said, a creature called Bennett's tree kangaroo, it lives in trees, it eats fruit. Local people hunt, kill, and eat the animal for meat. We introduced two additional conditions. Our concern was that, well, maybe people simply care less about an animal if the animal dies, right? Maybe just to avoid feeling bad, okay? If I learned that an animal's dead, maybe I just don't want to think about it suffering because it makes me feel bad. So we introduced the accidental death condition. We said, there's a Bennett's tree kangaroo, but I can't remember precisely, something like they live in tall trees. Sometimes the trees are struck by lightning and the animals die and fall out of them. That's it. So the animal dies, but it's not meat. We also thought, well, maybe human responsibility is playing a role here. So we're going to introduce a collected meat condition, which was the same as the accidental death, except at the end we added, trees get struck by lightning, the animal falls out, they're collected by local people who then eat the animal. So the animal is again categorized as meat, but people aren't responsible for its killing. So what do we find? What we found here, and this is perceived capacity to suffer as a function of condition. This is on a 1 to 10 point scale. What you see is that in the animal and accidental death condition, that's where there's no reference to meat. The animal gets a capacity to suffer of about 9. So people think, yeah, this animal can really suffer. When the same animal is framed as food, either collected or hunted, it loses about 1.5 points of perceived capacity to suffer. Right? So people say, you know what, this animal isn't as capable of suffering when I know that it's a food animal, that people eat it. So it's not hard to see from here, if you have a society that categorizes certain animals, like say pigs, as food, and other animals like say dogs as pets, that people will attribute the pig less capacity to suffer than the dog. We did a mediation analysis, and what we found was that this reduction in perceived capacity to suffer was driving a reduced moral concern. So basically, the argument we want to make is that when an animal is categorized as food, perceived capacity to suffer goes down. The less capable of suffering, the less moral concern. Okay. So I would say that society and basic psychology does a lot of the heavy lifting for meat eaters. Our industry and language work to break the meat-animal link. This is in industrialization and institutionalization. The categories into which we put animals make them more palatable and edible by reducing the amount we care about them. And as I said before, habitual eating can undermine reflection. There's a whole bunch of other stuff here about social norms, ritualization, cultural narratives that we could go into, but I wanted to give you a breadth of work that we've done in this field. If you want the depth, it's all covered in the review articles. Okay, so what happens when it fails? And it will fail, right? And it'll fail sometimes in really strange ways. So people might have seen Joaquin Phoenix's speech at the, I want to say Golden Globes or Oscars. I'm not a good guy for entertainment news, but certainly a context in which you don't expect someone to stand up and talk about animal rights, the dairy industry, and veganism. But he did. And so there's a whole bunch of people sat at home on their sofas trying to watch someone accept awards for good acting, who instead gets a dose of animal rights rhetoric, right? So for all the heavy lifting that society does, there will be times in our lives where the dissonance that comes from reporting that you care about animals and also that you eat animals is unavoidable. What happens when this occurs? Well, one thing we can do is we can stop eating animals. So vegetarians and vegans take this route where they say, you know what, I can't hold these two beliefs in mind at once. I'm just going to stop eating. Matt Ruby has a great review paper on this. Also, Matt Ruby and Hank Rothgerber are currently editing a special issue of the journal Appetite, which is all about vegans and vegetarians. It'll probably be out in about 6 months' time. And that'll be much more up to date than the 2012 review, I'm sure, and will be good to look at if you're really interested in these groups. Of course, we know that the majority of people don't do this. Okay, you can't find a Western country with a vegetarian population above about 6%, right? So most people don't do it. Most people find something else to do with that dissonance. I'm going to give you two examples of what they do. The first is that they justify their meat-eating consumption by excusing the self. And the second is that they change how they think about animals in a way that helps support their behavior. So let's do that. Okay, so we'll start with defensive meat eaters. Okay, so why is it okay to eat meat? Now, several years ago, Jared Piazza and I were talking about this, and we just read Melanie Joy's great book. Oh God, I'm getting the title confused with something else now. Why we love dogs, eat pigs, and wear cows, I think is the title of the book. It's by Melanie Joy, anyway. It's a very good read. And in it, she sort of says, well, why do people think it's okay to eat meat? And we sort of read her book and we thought, well, let's go and ask a bunch of people. So we got a bunch of people, several hundred in fact, and we just said to them, all meat eaters, and we said, well, why is it okay to eat meat? And they gave us a set of answers, all of which, oh, sorry, my Zoom is bugging out. People generated 4 main answers, all of which conveniently began with the letter N, which was really nice for us. So when we asked people why it's okay to eat meat, a bunch of people said, well, it's normal. Right? I eat meat. I've always eaten meat. Everyone I know eats meat. They've always eaten meat. It's just what people do, right? So that's one explanation people gave, that it's just a social norm to eat meat. The second is that it's natural. So we had a bunch of people say, humans are apex predators. I have canine teeth and a digestive tract with a small and large intestine because I evolved to eat meat. So this is a natural behavior. We had a bunch of people say they eat meat because it's necessary. So they say, you know, if I became a vegetarian or a vegan, I'd get anemia and die from lack of iron or whatever. To be healthy, you have to eat meat. And finally, we had a bunch of people say that they eat meat just because it tastes delicious. They said, well, you know, like I love bacon. And there's no doubt that because meat is packed with fat, protein, and salt, these are all things we've evolved to find tasty because they're difficult to extract from the environment. So there's some basis for why people may be saying that it tastes nice. So these are the 4 reasons people give. I think it's interesting to stop and reflect on whether these are acceptable moral justifications. This isn't a lecture on moral philosophy, it's a lecture on psychology and what people do, not whether it's justified or not. But I think a lot of philosophers of morality would have difficulty accepting those as justifications of behavior. Okay, not all of the defenses were equally represented. You see, the most common defense was necessary. So the idea that you have to eat meat to be healthy. And this is really predictable from a cognitive dissonance point of view. Cognitive dissonance only arises when the person feels they had a choice, right? If someone pulls out a gun and forces you to pop a child's balloon, right? Chances are you don't feel bad about popping the child's balloon because you feel that you were compelled to do it, right? By the person with the gun, okay? Being able to blame some external force for your behavior makes you feel better and avoid this dissonance state, right? So believing that meat eating is necessary for your survival and well-being gets rid of that, ameliorates that cognitive dissonance. It's not just that people possess these beliefs, the stronger their belief in the 4 N's, the stronger their meat commitment. That's the MCS column here. These are just correlation coefficients. It also is predictive of how much of different types of meat they eat. So people who endorse the 4 N's eat more beef, more pork, more chicken, more fish to an extent. The lamb effects are a bit wonky and we didn't really know why, but it was explained to me by a colleague that people just don't eat very much lamb in America. So people might have found it weird that you were asking about lamb. That's the curse of being an Australian, I guess. So one way in which people reduce cognitive dissonance is by having a suite of defenses, all conveniently beginning with the letter N, that help them avoid feeling bad about the fact they eat animals, avoiding that dissonance state. Okay. The second way in which people can reduce their dissonance, I would argue, is by changing the way they think about animals' minds, right? And changing the way they think about their minds in such a way as to undermine their moral concern. Now, it's a claim that having moral rights requires having some sort of mind. And this is an argument that's been put forward by the late Dan Wegner, and Kurt Gray in social psychology pretty extensively. And the argument goes something like this, right? Oh, there's the citation, in fact, Why Mind Attribution. So there's a great paper in 2007 in the journal Science by Heather Gray, Kurt Gray, and Dan Wegner, arguing that moral concern is partially rooted in mind attribution. And what they basically, to give you an example of that, you know, if I was to tell you that I kicked a rock down the street, you probably wouldn't think any less of me as a person. It seems totally acceptable to kick a rock down the street. But if I told you if I kicked the rock down the street, you would probably think less of me as a person. It's more, well, you might think I'm really, really strong, which I'm certainly not. I couldn't actually kick Dwayne Johnson down the street. He could kick me down the street. The reason why we think it's okay to kick a rock down the street, but not okay to kick the rock down the street, is because we see the rock as having a mind, and that we understand that it would hurt him if he was kicked down the street, and therefore it's not morally acceptable to engage in that kind of behavior. By contrast, we don't see a rock as having any sort of mind. It can't suffer, it can't feel harm, and therefore I can kick, break up, destroy a rock and with no moral consequence. Now, most things in the world around us fall neatly into categories of things that have minds or things that don't. But there are some borderline cases. And I would argue that animals are a borderline case where people can be flexible in how much mind they're prepared to give to that animal. The more mind you give it, the more it should be like a person. And you should say, you know what, we can't harm this creature. The less mind you give it, the more it should be like an object. And the more you should say, you know what, it's okay to harm this thing. So Brock Bastian and I started looking at this some years ago. And the first thing we did was simply get a large group of different animals, and we got people to rate them on how much mind the animal had. So how much of a complex mind do you think it possesses? And how edible is the animal? So how much would you want to eat this animal? And what you see here is a pretty robust negative correlation. The animals that we see as really smart, things like dogs, monkeys, gorillas, dolphins, we don't want to eat. By contrast, there's a bunch of animals that we see as not very smart, prawns, fish, chickens, cows, sheep, that we see as highly edible. Now, it's not a perfect correlation. Of course, you've got your stupid animals people don't want to eat, or stupid animals people don't want to eat, like houseflies. But if you take, and I don't know if you can see my mouse, potentially not, but if you look at cow in the top right corner, and you look down at the bottom left corner, bottom right corner, you'll see horse. The difference between cow and horse is considerable in terms of edibility. People want to eat cows, they don't want to eat horses, but it's also considerable in terms of mind. And is it really the case that a horse is that much smarter than a cow? It seems unlikely. It seems more likely, rather, people are being flexible in how smart they see different animals, potentially in a way to make themselves feel better about eating that animal. So we did a couple of follow-up studies. In one study, we assigned people to two conditions. In one, they learned that there was a pig just living on a farm somewhere, and the pig was living on the farm. It was fed food, generic information like that. In the second condition, they learned the exact same information, but they also learned that the pig was being raised for human consumption. It would be sent to market, slaughtered, and butchered, and sent out for people to eat. And what we found, this is mind attribution, what we found is that there was this small effect where people who saw the animal as food attributed it less mind than people who saw it as non-food. They're the exact same animal. The kind of, one of the largest studies we did in this line of work, we got a group of 100 odd participants into the lab. All of them were omnivores. And we got them to start by rating the mental capacities of a cow. We had a long list of mental traits, and we said, how much can a cow experience this trait, that trait, et cetera, et cetera. We then got our participants to do 45 minutes of filler tasks. So they did a whole bunch of other stuff, basically just designed to get them to forget about their ratings of the cow. We then told them, you know, for the last task in this collection of tasks we get you to do, we're going to ask you to sample some meat, right? And, you know, out of the laboratory, out of the fridge came a plate. It had cold cuts of roast beef on it, you know, like laid out nicely, bit of parsley, butcher's trimmings, all that kind of stuff out on a plate, put in front of the participant. And we said, we're going to get you to sample this beef. But before we do that, there's one other thing we had to do. We forgot, it should have been in the packet earlier. We need you to write about either the origins of meat, so where does meat come from, or the origins of vegetables. And the idea here is that for the origins of meat, we really wanted to drive home this connection, not let people not think about it. We then got them to complete the mental ratings of the cow and then complete a measure of positive and negative mood, so the PANAS. What we found, this is relative to baseline. When we look at the aspects of a mind that are related to morality, so things like capacity to suffer, people in the meat condition gave the cow significantly less capacity to suffer than they did before. So people seem to turn down the ratings on how much they see a cow as capable of suffering when they know they have to eat beef. And this reduction in morality-related capacities mediated the link between the condition and how bad participants felt. So the argument we want to make here is that if you know you have to eat meat, you reduce the mind you give a cow. The more you can reduce it, the better you feel. So I'm going to just finish up now with one final study talking about how we might go about changing people's meat-eating behavior, perhaps by targeting mind perception. And this was some work that Jared Piazza and I did back in, I know it was recently published and we've got more forthcoming. So there's a paper here. If people are interested, I could send it. If it's the case that people are denying mind to animals to make them easier to eat, might increasing the mind that an animal is perceived to have make it seem less edible. What we did is we did a set of studies. I'm just going to tell you about two of them. In the first study, what we did is we got 3 animals and we presented each animal with the exact same information. All we changed was the animal's name. Okay. One of the animals was a pig, right? And we all know about pigs, and our participants were all omnivores. The second was a tapir. Now, full disclosure, I chose tapirs because I thought they looked like pigs when I looked them up online. I then went to a zoo with my son and I saw a tapir in real life, and they are enormous. They are way bigger than pigs. They're like mini elephants, but I didn't know that. Hopefully the participants were as ignorant as me. Exact same information about intelligence and whatnot, the mental life, but instead of being about a pig, it was about a tapir. And thirdly, we had an animal called a trablin. Trablin is a totally made up animal, and our participants knew it was made up, right? We said scientists on a distant planet found a trablin, right? So this is just a fictitious animal, but it's the exact same information. We then got a manipulation check to make sure people understood the animal had a mind, and we then got people to rate the moral standing. So how bad they'd feel, how guilty if the animal was treated badly, and how wrong it would be to eat the animal. So what do we find? Well, when it's tapirs and trablins, people care about the animal, right? This is on a 100-point scale. People are saying, yeah, this animal has quite high moral standing. But when the exact same information was presented about pigs, not so much. Even though the manipulation checks were the same, so people understood the information, somehow learning that a pig is smart doesn't give the pig more moral rights in the same way of learning that a tapir is smart or a trablin is smart. We did a second follow-up study to this where we said, okay, we're just going to focus in on pigs, but we're going to change who's learning the information. Okay, so participants were randomly assigned to learn either that pigs were really smart or really stupid. That's the high-low intelligence condition. And then they either read it from their perspective, that's the me condition, where I'm just presented with the information. I just read that pigs are smart or stupid. Or they were assigned to the John perspective, in which they said, there's a guy called John, right? He's a student at university. He has to do an assignment and he learns that pigs are smart or that pigs are stupid. And it was a big chunk of text. So we had a 2x2 design. Pigs were either smart or stupid, and either that was learned by the participant or participants learned that John learned it. We then asked them to rate their perception of the pig's moral standing or what they thought John's perception would be. So how much would John care about pigs? In the John condition, we get what you might expect, which is when John learns pigs are highly intelligent, he cares a lot about them. And when John learns pigs are low intelligence, he cares less, right? But when it's me doing the learning, nothing, right? Me learning about the intelligence of pigs has no impact on my rating of the pig, but it has an impact on John's ratings. Okay, so I would think it's fair to conclude that we don't like eating smart animals. People don't want to do it. But when we do eat animals, we deny the mind, making them seem less intelligent. And we seem particularly good at avoiding or disregarding, is a better way to say that, disregarding intelligence information when we have to make moral judgments about the animals we eat. Okay, so what does it all mean? I think it means that if we wanted to change people's meat eating, we could do a couple of things. We could make people realize perhaps that animals fall into categories other than food. And we're doing some work on this at the moment about multiple categorization. It's a good way of reducing prejudice. Does it also work for animals? We could kind of force them to realize that meat is animals and put them cut through the dissonance avoidance and force that feeling of dissonance so that there's something to act on. We could show them that necessary, normal, nice, and natural are perhaps not good, are common, but not good reasons for moral behavior. Oh, and I'm missing one dot point. Sorry, it's gone off the end there. I would say the last thing we could do is we could be mindful of the fact that simply giving people information about how smart, nice, friendly, capable of suffering farm animals are is not going to work, in my opinion, because people are really good at disregarding this information. So thanks for listening. That's what I had planned for you today, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.